Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to another video. And today I'm going to be telling you about some of my favourite books that I read in 2025. So this is kind of part two. Back on Monday, I told you about my favourite classics that I read in 2025, and today I want to tell you about my favourite contemporary books. So I think all but one of these books are from the 21st century. I think there's one from the 90s, but they're all, more recent books than the books I was talking about on Monday. So on Monday, I ranked my classics sort of more substantially, but I'm not really going to do very much ranking today. I have more books to go through today, which kind of reflects what I was saying about Monday. I feel like I read fewer standout classics in 2025, though I did, as usual, read roughly the same amount of contemporary and classics, but I feel like there were just fewer standouts amongst the classics in 2025. But anyway, I read a lot of amazing contemporary or modern-ish literature in 2025. On Monday, when I spoke about my favourite classics of the year, I did a loose top 10 ranking, but I'm just not really going to rank these books today because I sort of tried and then I kept looking at my ranking and not being content with it, and then I just thought, you know what, I won't rank the books. I will separate it by category and I will end with my favourite book of the year, because I do have a definitive favourite book, or at least favourite modern book of the year, so we'll end with that one, but otherwise I'll just talk about my favourites of the year in general. Most of this video is going to be featuring fiction, but there is one non-fiction book I wanted to mention, my favourite non-fiction book of the year, and that's this, Jane Austen's Bookshelf by Rebecca Romney, which is a really fascinating work of literary investigation and literary history, looking at the female writers who were really popular during Jane Austen's time and just before Jane Austen's time, and why they have fallen out of the canon. And it's a really interesting dissection of the canon as a thing, as well as talking about the lives of these women. I found it fascinating, and it also guided me to read some 18th century novels that I hadn't read before and enjoyed. So I'm really, really glad that I read this in 2025, and I would highly recommend it. My favourite poetry book of the year was in fact not a collection by an individual author, but an anthology called Joy, edited and produced by the Poetry Pharmacy. This is a collection of joyful poems that was just beautiful and so well chosen and just really, really exquisite. I did read the physical copy, but I have forgotten where it is, so I can't show it to you, but it was a great read. I would highly recommend it. And then I also had a favourite graphic novel of the year, which is this. This is Mamo by Sass Milledge, which I read in December and really, really loved. This is a really sweet coming-of-age story, love story about two young women who are trying to save a village from some magical stuff. It's a work of fantasy, had a very Studio Ghibli vibe, was very, very beautifully illustrated, and I just really thoroughly enjoyed this one. There are three authors who I read two books from this year, both of which I absolutely loved, so I thought I would kind of talk about them as sort of some of my favourite authors of the year. So the first one is Emily Henry, who's a romance writer. The two books I read by her this year were Funny Story and Great Big Beautiful Life, both of which I really loved. I think Emily Henry just writes fantastic romance novels with the balance I want between the love story and everything else. I love both of these, but especially Funny Story, which I just, found really, really entertaining and really heartwarming, which is kind of how I always find Emily Henry books. I just think her novels are an absolute delight. And the other two authors are authors of historical crime. So here I have two books by Jessica Bull, who writes the Miss Austen Investigate series, which are a series of books about Jane Austen being a sleuth, which is just utterly delightful. So here we have the second book in the series, A Fortune Most Fatal, and then we have the Austen Christmas Murders, which is a Christmas novella. Both of these came out this year, and both of these I really, really enjoyed. I just really enjoyed the portrayal of Jane Austen and her family and friends in these books. It just really rings true with Jane Austen as you see in her letters, and I just find these books incredibly fun as well as sort of fast-paced and really engaging. And yeah, I would just highly recommend this series a lot. And I also read two books by Alex Hay, The Housekeepers and The Queen of Fives. These are historical crime, but not mysteries exactly. So The Housekeepers is a heist novel about some former servants in the Edwardian period pulling off a heist on a house where they used to work. And then The Queen of Fives is a con novel about a woman in the late Victorian period who is trying to con a duke out of his fortune, and it's not what you expect, and it's so good. If anyone ever used to watch Hustle, or if you like something like Now You See Me but you also like the Victorian period, then this this is what you need to read. It was magnificent. Then there are 3 crime thriller books I wanted to mention in this video. One is This Can Never Not Be Real by Sarah Milano. This is a YA thriller about a terrorist attack and 4 teenagers who are caught up in it, and it's just really powerful and really tense and very well done, and I think balances the very complex, disturbing, distressing themes with really excellent characterization. It's told from multiple perspectives and moves between them very quickly in a way that I thought worked really well, so I'd highly recommend this. I also really loved Wrong Place, Wrong Time by Gillian McAllister, which is a time travel crime thriller, and we're following a woman, and she is one evening looking out her window waiting for her son to come home, her teenage son, and then she sees him outside the window kill someone. Her son is arrested, and then the next day she wakes up, and instead of it being the next day, it is the previous day, and she is working backwards in time to try and work out what led to all of these events. And it's just great. It's just really clever, really well crafted, with really good twists and turns, really great characterization, and just a great mystery. And I was just really impressed by it. And I also wanted to mention No Safe Place by Hannah Brennan, which is an amazing thriller, the first in a series, in which a police officer is looking into the attempted murder of a well-known psychologist, and the links it may have with a clinical study he did 15 years before on teenagers with OCD. And we follow the investigation as well as following the now grown-up teenagers who were once involved in that trial. And this is simultaneously a really good crime novel that is intensely gripping and really fast-paced, and also a really complex, nuanced, authentic look at OCD and the experience of living with OCD and how it is very different for different people. And I just think it is amazing. I know Hannah in real life, and I had sort of read this book before, so this is like kind of a reread, but kind of not a reread, because I had read bits of this book in its earlier forms, but I hadn't read its final form until this year, and I just loved it. I just think it's fantastic. I want to talk about some books that are not historical fiction, but otherwise I don't really know where to place them, and then I'll move on to the historical fiction. So let's start with this. This is The Girl on the 88 Bus by Freya Sampson. This is a wonderful, really heartwarming, lovely novel that I read this year in one sitting, and it was just one of those books that was just like exactly what I needed at the time. It's a story of a young woman who, after the breakup of her long-term relationship, moves to London and is looking for hope, and ends up encountering this elderly man on a bus who says that he takes this bus often because he is looking for someone he met a very long time ago. And our main character says, well, I'll help you look for this woman, and everything kind of goes on from there. And it's just great. It's just so utterly delightful, and really hopeful, and a book with a real sort of belief in the power of humanity, and I just really like that a lot, so highly recommend this one. Then another top book of the year is The Favourite by Fran Littlewood. This is the story of 3 grown-up sisters, and the kind of fallout of this family when one day at a family gathering, a particular incident reveals to them all that the father has a favourite daughter, and it's looking at all of their lives and the complex tensions in the family's past and all of the very different ways that these sisters interact with each other and with the rest of their family. And it's so well done. It's so exquisitely created. The characterization is just great. And these 3 sisters' very different stories and very different problems are really well explored. And I just thought it was magnificently done. I love Fran Littlewood. I think she's such a fantastic writer. I loved her debut, Amazing Grace Adams, as well. And I think she's one of those writers that just does family dynamics and family problems really well, and it's just really good. I highly recommend The Favourite. Okay, another book I loved in 2025 was Conclave by Robert Harris. This is a tense political thriller about the election of a new pope, and you wouldn't think that quite so much tension could be injected into a book that is mostly just a bunch of old men sat around talking about things, but it's so tense. I love Robert Harris a lot, and I just thought this was fantastic. His characterization and his insights into power, I guess, is just great. So yeah, highly recommend this one. Another book I absolutely loved reading in 2025 was I Who Have Never Known Men by Jacqueline Hartman, translated from the French by Rod Swartz. This is a 1990s Belgian science fiction novel about a girl, later young woman, who has grown up in a cage with 39 women. She doesn't know why they're here, why they've been kept prisoner, why there are guards watching them who never interact with them, never let them out. She has no idea what happened that led to this situation. All she knows is that she has grown up in this cage and she is surrounded by adult women who remember a world and a life before. And everything kind of goes on from there. It's such a fascinating book. Really, really powerful, really, really excellent psychology, like the psychology of the main character and how the odd life she has lived has affected her mind. It's fascinating. It's a very kind of ambiguous novel that leaves many questions unanswered, but I thought kind of as a character study and a look at how this situation would affect this character, it was just impeccably done. One book I read in December and just thought was amazing was Orbital by Samantha Harvey. Is this my second favourite book of the year? Maybe. Orbital by Samantha Harvey is an incredible short novel that is really just a kind of ponderous exploration of humanity. It's about a group of astronauts who are in a spacecraft orbiting Earth, and it's about their lives and their observations and thoughts as they look at Earth. It is very literary. I would say that in general I'm a more plot-driven reader, and this does not have a plot, but I think because of its length, I didn't mind the lack of plot, and I thought the characterization and the writing and the themes were just so well done, and this book is just so exquisitely written that I just absolutely loved it. I did a full video on this in December when I read it, so I'll leave that link down below, and I'll do the same for any other books I've reviewed individually. But yeah, I just thought this was an absolute masterpiece. Before we get into the like full historical fiction, I have some books that engage with history or like linger on the boundaries of historical fiction. So first I want to talk about The Ministry of Time by Kayleigh Bradley, which I absolutely love. This is a really weird book that is not going to be for everyone, but I just thought was so much fun and just like an utter delight and a very me kind of book. It's weird, it's very weird, it does a lot of like genre blending and sets up like certain genre expectations and then almost like takes you into a different genre entirely. So this is the story of a young woman who works at the Ministry of Time, and the Ministry of Time and the British government have discovered time travel, and our main character, who is a civil servant, is charged with looking over and observing a man who has been pulled from the Victorian period and deposited in the present day. And she is watching over him to see how he adjusts to the present day. And meanwhile, there are several other people who have been pulled from different points in time and brought to the present who have other civil servants looking after them. This book is part science fiction, part romance, part espionage thriller, and it's just delightful. I just found like the scenes where various people from different points in time are just chatting to each other such an utter delight. It's just absolutely the kind of thing I love. Now that I'm talking about this book again, I feel like this is my second favourite book of the year. Anyway, I just had a wonderful, wonderful time with this book. And then I also wanted to talk about This Motherless Land by Nikki May, another novel I loved this year. I put this on the edge of historical fiction because this is set sort of from the 70s through to the 90s, so it is historical, but very, very recent historical. This Motherless Land is set between Nigeria and the UK, and it is a loose retelling of Mansfield Park, a very loose retelling. It kind of takes the premise of Mansfield Park by Jane Austen, but goes in entirely different directions. So we have a girl called Funke, who is the equivalent of Fanny Price in Mansfield Park, who after the death of her mother in Nigeria is sent to live with her aunt and cousins in England. Her aunt especially treats her very badly, but she becomes friends with her cousin Liv, and the story goes on from there. It's a powerful coming of age story with really interesting characterization and really great themes, and I really liked it as a take on Mansfield Park that was doing something very different and was more like a thematic retelling than a plot retelling. It just really worked for me, and I would highly recommend it. And then before I get into the sort of historical fiction proper, another favourite of the year was The Hymn to Dionysus by Natasha Pulley. This is set in ancient Greece, so it's historical, but it's very, very magical, and it's probably more on the sort of like myth retelling than full historical. This is the story of a man, a soldier, whose life is very much disrupted when someone who may or may not be the god Dionysus comes into his life. I really love Natasha Pulley's books. There's something about the way she writes that is just like peak emotional investment for me. And this one was a really, really good read with some fascinating elements. I really liked the depiction of ancient Greece and the society captured in this book, and the twists and turns of the plot were very well done indeed. And now we're fully in historical fiction. One book I read in December and absolutely loved was The 12 Days of Christmas by Susan Stokes Chapman. This is an interconnected short story collection made up of 12 stories inspired by the Christmas Carol or rhyme, The 12 Days of Christmas. It's set in England at Christmas 1816, and in each story you follow a different character with a different plot, but all in the same town, many connected to the same house. So you get to see other characters in stories that are not their own. You get the ending to some stories in other stories, and just the way this book is interwoven is just so well done. I also thought its depiction of Regency society was great, and especially looking at the darker elements of early 19th century society and the legacy of the Napoleonic Wars, I just thought was really, really good. Would highly recommend this very, very much, though it is quite festive, so maybe save it for Christmas. And another book I loved this year was Nettle Black by Nat Reeve, which is a really fun romp of a novel set in the late Victorian period about a young woman who runs away from home to escape being married off and ends up joining a group of lady detectives who are investigating strange occurrences in the local town. I will say that from the cover of this book, I was expecting it to be really gothic, and it's not really gothic. It is very, very fun. It is a wonderful, joyous romp for anyone who loves the Victorian period. It's also a really fantastic coming-of-age story dealing with issues of gender and sexuality in a really complex, wonderful way. And I loved the main character so much. One of those main characters where you just really want them to be okay. And I just, thoroughly enjoyed this one. Would highly recommend it. Right, I have 6 books left to talk to you about in this video, 6 favourites of the year, and I have to say I think it is quite a staggering testament to the Walter Scott Prize for historical fiction that they are all from the Walter Scott Prize long list. I think I read 9 or 10 books out of the long list of 12, and that 6 of them have gone on to be in my favourite books of the year, I think is pretty cool. I love the Walter Scott Prize. I've been reading along with it for many years, and yeah, this year was an especially great one. And I haven't even included in this video the winner of the Walter Scott Prize in 2025, The Land in Winter by Andrew Miller, which I did also really love and maybe should also be on this list, but you know, I've already made the list, it's fine. The first one I want to talk about is The Mayor by Angrid Hampshire, which is a complicated novel to say that you love because it's quite a upsetting novel in many ways. This book is based on a true story and explores the life of a woman who was a concentration camp guard for the Nazis before and during the Second World War. And this book is told from 2 perspectives. One perspective is her husband, her American husband, who she married after the war, who didn't know what she had done during the war, and we're following him as they meet, as they fall in love, and what happens when, much later on in life, he discovered that she had been a concentration camp guard. This is all what really happened. And then the other perspective is his wife, before and during the Second World War, looking at what led her to work in a concentration camp, looking at what she did, how she justified it to herself. I did a whole review at the time, which I'll leave linked down below, but there's a quote at the start of the book: "The most frightening news brought about by the Holocaust and by what we learned of its perpetrators was not the likelihood that this could be done to us, but the idea that we could do it." And I think that is the sort of premise of the book. How do ordinary humans come to perpetrate atrocities? And yeah, I would really recommend The Mayor. It is an upsetting novel, but it is really important, and I also think it is less upsetting than you might expect because of the way it's written. I also loved A Sign of Her Own by Sarah Marsh, a really powerful novel about a young deaf woman growing up in the US, about her coming of age and her experiences being taught a method of speech by Alexander Graham Bell, the inventor of the telephone, and what happens many, many years later when Alexander Graham Bell comes back into her life. This book is really well written, really accessible, really interesting, dealing with really complex things. Taught me a lot about a bit of history I didn't know very much about, as well as being a truly fantastic character study. I would really recommend this book. I've now run out of my physical books. The last 4 I read on audiobook or ebook. So one that I listened to on audiobook was The Safekeep by Yael van der Ruden, which I thought was a really fantastic novel. The Safekeep is set in the Netherlands in the 1960s and looks at a young woman who lives a pretty solitary life and doesn't really like socializing with other people very much. But one day her brother asks if his new girlfriend can come and live with her for a while, and she feels she has no choice but to say yes. So she ends up living with this other young woman, Eva, who she doesn't really know, she doesn't really like, who she is suspicious of, and everything goes on from there. And I feel like to tell you more would be to spoil it, but I thought it was really, really well written, very intense. It's a really intense novel, very powerful, very interesting, and yeah, definitely one I'd recommend. Another highlight of the year was Clear by Karis Davis, a very short, really impactful historical novel set in the 19th century, looking at the Scottish clearances. We're following two men, one of whom has been sent to an island to evict the sole tenant of that island, a farmer called Ivan, and we follow the dynamic between these two men who don't speak the same language and have limited ways of communication. And it's a book about language and communication in the very best ways, and I just absolutely loved it and would highly, highly recommend it. Okay, the penultimate book I have to talk about in this video is Mother Naked by Glenn James Brown. Maybe this is my second favourite book of the year. Anyway, Mother Naked is this really fantastic book set in the medieval period, all told in the form of a spoken story. So Mother Naked is a minstrel, an entertainer, who has come to Durham Cathedral to tell a story, and he is telling a story. The whole narrative is the story that he tells, but there's sort of like three layers to this. There is this ghost story he is telling about this village and what happened to it and why it was haunted afterwards. That's the kind of main layer, I suppose. Then there is also a story he is telling about a friend of his, another minstrel. And then there's also the sort of like story of him telling the story in the moment, the interactions he's having with the people around him in Durham Cathedral. And it's great. It's so good. You have to read it. The reading experience of Mother Naked was just wonderful. It's just one of those books that is just kind of perfect. And finally, my favourite book of 2025 would have to be Glorious Exploits by Ferdia Lennon, which just absolutely blew me away. This is a work of historical fiction I read earlier in the year when I was reading along with the Walter Scott Prize, as with the last few, and I just was absolutely astounded by it. It is set in Syracuse in ancient Sicily after the Peloponnesian Wars, after a failed Athenian invasion of Sicily. And a lot of Athenian prisoners of war are all trapped in the quarry, not being fed, kind of having been left for dead. And we are following two out-of-work Sicilian potters who entertain themselves by talking to the prisoners of war. One of them is obsessed with Athenian theatre, and so they decide they're going to put on a play, direct a play using the Athenian prisoners as the actors, and bribing them to take part with food. We follow what happens from there on out, and it's a weird premise, but just, you have to trust me. It is an absolutely incredible novel. One of the best explorations of power that I've ever read, with amazing characterization. Lampo, the narrator, is just, he's so frustrating and he's so flawed, but you love him. And I thought the characterization was so well done. It's also told in a wonderful way. It's a first-person narrative with a very distinctive narrative voice and a very Irish narrative voice. Ferdia Lennon is Irish. I would highly recommend the audiobook, which he reads himself. It's just perfect. The narrative voice, the themes, the characterization, the plot. It's so funny and so devastating and dark. And I just thought it was absolutely amazing. Like, it just completely blew me away. And yeah, what a book. What a book. So yeah, those are my favourite contemporary books that I read in 2025. If you want to know about my favourite classics that I read last year, I will leave that video linked down below as well. And yeah, I read a lot of great books in 2025, and it was nice going through this list and reminding myself of all the wonderful things I've read this year. So do let me know down in the comments what was your favourite modern book of 2025, or indeed your favourite book of 2025 as a whole. That's all for now. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.